Hello and welcome to a lecture on Cuba and the Cold War. And so this is sort of before Castro comes into power and up to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So we need to keep in mind that Cuba, prior to the revolution, prior to the Castro brothers taking control of it, it was, in a lot of ways, it was America's playground. And, the beautiful beaches, the casinos, the party lifestyle, the mafia, the Italian mafia mobsters owned many of the casinos, and it was a moneymaker, and it was a playground, especially for the wealthy and connected in American society. And the island, the land itself, was effectively owned by America, and in particular the United Fruit Company, and growing sugar and bananas, and using for labor, peasants, Cuban peasants, and it was something that America, very much valued and made a lot of money off of. Picture inside the nightclubs and the casinos, and America had their guy, dictator Fulgencio Batista, and he was the strong man, the dictator of Cuba, and he was sort of America's son of a bitch down in Cuba, keeping a lid on things. But along comes Fidel Castro, who was able to lead a successful revolution against Batista and took control of the island. Now, he's not a communist revolutionary, he's simply just a revolutionary. He wants to see Cuba for Cuba, and the situation that was in place before was really not fair to the majority of Cuban people. And after he comes into power, he makes some changes. He nationalized the land, meaning he the government took control of the land, took it away from the property owners. As we said, many of them were American corporations. And he gave that land to the peasants to farm on their own. And the U.S., in retaliation for this, imposed a trade embargo. And that trade embargo is only recently being lifted here in the year 2016. And President Dwight D. Eisenhower, he asked the CIA to develop a plan to depose of Castro, and so America can go back to the situation that existed before. This, the embargo and, the potential, invasion of Cuba by the Americans, led Castro to turn to support, and where he can get some support is from the Soviet Union. And he turned to them for some very basic needs, and oil was a particular one. And so the CIA develops their plan, and their plan is to train Cuban exiles, those who had been sort of kicked out of Cuba or left voluntarily and want to go back to the old situation. These would be people who would have had influence before, and to train them in military exercises. And then when you do invade with these Cuban exiles, you provide American air support, and then there will be a rising up and of the Cuban people as they join up, and this will lead to success, and we'll have a successful invasion plan. And there are some of them there. But meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., in the United States, we have a new president, John F. Kennedy, coming into power. And he's coming in, he's very idealistic and very liberal. And, he talks a lot about peace. And he's not necessarily going to be as supportive of this plan as Dwight D. Eisenhower may have been. And we can see there is Dwight D. Eisenhower on the left, next to Supreme Court Judge Earl Warren, and on the right we got Lyndon Baines Johnson, the vice president, and the outgoing vice president Richard Nixon. And this is the famous "ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country" speech that he was giving here. So they present the plan to JFK, and he agreed with it, but he insisted that American involvement must remain hidden. In no way can America be seen as being involved in this. And he orders, when the invasion goes through, to put the air support down. And the Cubans and Castro, they overreact, thinking that it's a full-on American invasion, and so they send everybody out to defend against this band of Cuban exiles that are coming in, which is not a very large invading force. And this is a total embarrassment. It's a complete and utter fiasco, as the the invaders are taken captive. JFK pays a ransom in food and medicine to get them out, and it is a complete and total behavior. And both sides then go and blame each other, with JFK claimed he was sort of misinformed of the plan and that they were overconfident in its success. The CIA blaming JFK for ordering the air support down, saying that was a crucial part of it. And the reality is that Cuba has their sovereignty and is now a base to export revolution to elsewhere in Latin America, and nobody really knows what to do next about the island. And this is when Khrushchev makes his sort of move here. He puts medium-range hydrogen bombs into Cuba and sneaks them into Cuba. And American spy planes quickly notice they are there, and the Cuban Missile Crisis begins. And this map was at one time top secret. You can see at the bottom it's been scratched out. And this map is showing, during the crisis, the map that they drew of how vulnerable they were, with the 3 different ranges of missiles that could be shot at the United States. And only Seattle being the only major American city outside of the range of these missiles. So the United States is extremely vulnerable to complete and utter destruction within seconds at any moment. And the Americans know one thing for sure, is that this situation cannot continue. Something must be done to remove those missiles. And JFK and his brother Bobby discussing the situation is not public at this point. Very few people within the government know about the situation and know that this threat is being imposed on the American people. It will be made public at one point during the whole 13 days that we have the crisis. So the cabinet and JFK, they're meeting and they're discussing what to do, and they really have no really good option. They've got 4 options, but none of them are all of them have their drawbacks. The first that they sort of consider is an airstrike, and this would be an attack directly on the missiles. So you're not invading, you're going straight for those missiles and missing them. But the downside is could be a retaliation strike by the Soviet Union, and most likely into West Berlin. It could lead to nuclear war. You might not get all of the missiles. They might be the missiles might be launched during the invasion. Second option was an all-out invasion, advocated by Curtis LeMay, who had ordered the firebombing on Japan. He is now leader of the Air Force. He and the military strongly support the invasion, to go in and do it right and get rid of Castro, get rid of the missiles, and get back to a situation normal that they had before. It's strongly opposed, though, by Bobby Kennedy, which is JFK's younger brother and top advisor, and he is very much concerned about the international reputation of the United States if they invade a small island nation of Cuba. Diplomacy, it was attempted. It did put America in a position of moral superiority, but it really didn't lead anywhere. And this was the public diplomacy that was done at the United Nations once it was very public of what the situation is. And they decide to go with the blockade, where they're going to put a series of Navy ships around Cuba and stop any Soviet ships coming in, and prevent the more weapons soldiers from coming in. And there is the risk of escalation. How will the Soviet Union react to this? But the onus for escalation is now to the Soviets. It puts the whole situation of what to do into the Soviet Union's camp. And in this way, this was a very smart move. Now, technically, a blockade is an act of war. It is an act of aggression, and the Soviet Union could take it for that this is sort of a declaration of war, and Cuba could also, be taking this position. And the world is sort of watching. The whole world is very tense. Is this going to be, what's the next step in all of this? And there's a Soviet ship approaching Cuba. You can see on its deck, it does have some nuclear weapons. That is an American Navy destroyer that's sort of ordering it to stop. There were, at some points, shots being fired, warning shots, not direct shots, and things are tense, very, very tense. Now, meanwhile, while this is happening, behind the scenes in sort of back-channel discussions, not going through direct government-to-government talks, but through sort of friends of Khrushchev in the United States, there are just sort of discussions of, can we make a deal? And they make a deal with the USSR agreeing to remove the missiles from Cuba. In return, JFK promised to never invade Cuba. And separately, but not part of this agreement because NATO had to be involved, but to the removal of nuclear weapons that were in Turkey that were a serious threat to the Soviet Union. And there's a lot of political fallout for this. Khrushchev was removed from power in a power move shortly afterwards. He was sort of seen as weak, and the Soviet Union is going to embark on a new program of strength. In the United States, a lot of criticism, very strong criticism against JFK, that he's soft and that he is weak. And for the Cuban Americans, they are furious, for the CIA, furious, for the mafia, furious about his failure in the sort of the Bay of Pigs, and then now his promise to not invade. Now, JFK and his supporters will say, well, look, he avoided war and avoided a potential nuclear war. And afterwards, there is a bit of an easing of tension. A hotline is set up, which is a direct phone between the two governments. So if you get this kind of situation again, you know, JFK can just pick up the phone and get on the phone right away to Khrushchev and discuss things. And later, a test ban treaty on nuclear weapons will come into place. And then we have the reality. Fidel Castro in control in Cuba and remains in control to this day in March 2016. He is very much incapacitated. He is quite sick. And his brother Raul in command. Now, as I say this in mid-March 2016, well, next week, Barack Obama will visit Cuba on a 3-day state visit. He's taking his family with him as well. This is quite historic. And the last president to visit the United States was in the 1920s. Silent Calvin Coolidge visited in the 1920s to Cuba. So an historic event coming up. All right. Thank you very much for listening.